Tienes magia, energía en tu mente. Te libera como ave, súbete a mi nave. Cultura que cura como un desmadre. Mate, brinca, brinca con mi gente. Piel canela como la tierra resiste.
Tonight's guest, Jesse Escalante.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the PsychoSocial Mental Health Show. I'm your host, Luis Cornejo, a licensed marriage and family therapist who specializes in sex therapy with queer and BIPOC folks.
Hi, I'm Lizzie Nojosa, your other host, and I specialize in expressive arts therapy and brain spotting.
And we're so excited about our guest today because we're going to be talking about harm reduction, which is going to include a bit of talk about Euphoria, which I know all of y'all are watching. So we want to welcome our guest today, Jesse Escalante.
Hi, thank you for having me. Hello, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being
Yeah,
here.
of course.
Sit down. Well, Jesse, thank you so much for being here with us. We're so excited to talk to you about harm reduction. So if you could share a little bit about yourself first and just tell us, what you do, who you are, and also why harm reduction.
Yeah, I'm Jesse Escalante. I am a second year MSW student at UC Berkeley. I am 25, thank you. Some salient identities are identified as queer, Latin, neurodivergent, first generation, so those identities are really important to me. I'm also a dancer, so I'm a professional contemporary dancer in the city, San Francisco. And why harm reduction? I would say harm reduction is more than just about reducing harm. It's really about saving lives, and it's about how we show care and empathy and compassion for people. And I think once we get more into the topic, my hope is that viewers will realize that this framework really is about how do you show up for others.
Great. And you are a huge advocate for harm reduction. I've seen your work on social media and how you're advocating and also pushing for more awareness around it. And I'm curious if you're open to sharing why harm reduction. Why is that something that is very important to you, as a person, as an individual?
Yeah, so harm reduction is important to me because as someone that grew up with the family history of substance use, I really saw the way that the stigma, the shame, and the criminalization of substances really affected my family dynamics. And like most families, that kind of ran in our system. And so as I engaged with substances throughout my life, there was a lot of that shame and that stigma because we weren't having honest conversations about how to use substances safely, how do you engage in them in a less harmful way. And so harm reduction has really saved my life from time to time again because I've been able to implement it and use it as a therapeutic approach so I can evaluate my relationship with substances.
Yeah.
Jesse, and how do you define harm reduction?
I define harm reduction as a compassionate and caring stance on behaviors that can be harmful, but can also be fun and exciting to engage in. So it's looking at the duality of behaviors that, it's not a black and white situation that one behavior is automatically unhealthy or it is, appropriate. There's a balance between that. And it's also an anti-oppressive and anti-racist framework, which I hope we'll get more into, because to me, that's the most important part of harm reduction, that it is fighting against an anti-racist and anti-oppressive system.
And thank you so much for naming that. I think that's super important, right, when we're talking about substances, because I know we could go on and on and on to talking about not just policies, but also social ideas and concepts around what substance users are referred to or called, but also the beliefs, right, around people who use substances. So my question for you is, this is such a beautiful way of really thinking about people, right, as people who need support and love. And it seems very opposite of what is currently held, I guess, as social views. Tell me a little bit about your perspective. What is the general, I guess, idea around substances right now, or what is the socially pushed I guess, attitude about substances?
Yeah. And before I get into that question, one disclaimer that I do want to say is that, I'm not here to say that one way is the right way. And so in answering your question, I think the honest answer is that we push sobriety and we push the 12 steps onto people or individuals that are not ready for it. And so that is currently where we're at in an American stance, through policy, through macro and micro procedures. We feel that complete sobriety, complete abstinence is the only way to be in recovery. What that does is that actually increases rates of overdoses, it increases rates of substance usage, and it increases the shame and the stigma. So as the U.S. goes, that's where we're at. We're not having conversations on harm reduction. There are some progressive cities that implement it, like San Francisco and Oakland, but those are smaller scales. Those are in the larger context of things.
Thank you for explaining that, because I think when we're talking about harm reduction, it is super important to really take into account how it is an alternative, right, to the currently held belief of how do we support people with substance use. And like you were explaining and sharing, I think currently, at least from my own personal perspective, there is a lot of shame and stigma, like you said, and it does not help, right? There's no solution. And I know that you have been someone that is extremely open, extremely vulnerable online, and you share a lot about your own personal experience, but you also have shared that you get some hate, right? Some people that come at you about feeling that maybe you're pushing for substance use or thinking that you're not being too hard on folks who want to use substances. And so my question is, what are some misconceptions or myths that you hear or that you have to deal with about harm reduction?
Yeah, one misconception, and I really want to advocate for this, is that harm reduction automatically means that you are using substances. That is not true. Sobriety is actually harm reduction because your approach of reducing harm is complete abstinence. And so harm reduction does not always mean that you're engaging with substances. It means that you are doing the best recovery that is meant for you. So that's one misconception I really want to get to. It is not enabling. It is not saying, do whatever you want to do and you're not held accountable. No, there's still accountability, because as someone that works in a mental health clinic, you still have a treatment plan, you still have goals and objectives of what the substance use looks like, whether that's moderation, being sober from certain substances, but still using moderation with others, using intentionally. So harm reduction looks so many different ways. It's not just like this one image of what harm reduction is. And I think those are the two big misconceptions. Yeah,
and I was curious too, because I've seen so much in the media with celebrities, right, who struggle with their own sobriety or who are coping or trying to really learn ways of managing. And I know Demi Lovato was someone that talks a lot about it, gets a lot of hate. And I think there was this whole thing with their kind of an idea around like California sober or whatever they're talking about. And I don't know if you know anything about that or if there's something you can share in terms of your thoughts on what that means, but also how celebrities, right, and people who are very successful also struggle with these kinds of things and the way that society responds to them.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. I love Demi Lovato, and I followed their journey since I've been very young. And I remember I had friends that were in the 12-step programs posting on social media, like calling out Demi Lovato for not coining the term, but using the term California sober, and feeling that this was a big slap in the face to the 12-step community, that they were perpetuating this idea that you could use the moderation while lying to yourself about your recovery. And I was really upset because, again, this is some of the downfalls of 12 steps. It's either you're completely sober and abstinent, or you're not allowed in the rooms, right? Or it's very black and white. And so I think I don't know if I agree with the term California sober, but I wish that the conversation was around harm reduction and moderation. I think because the word sober was in there, it rubbed people wrong because it was like, well, how can you be sober if you're smoking weed and drinking? That doesn't really make any sense.
Yeah, it's very absolute, right? The way that it's
and so I think harm reduction, moderation, those are more those are the like the better terms that I would want to use, but I fully supported that journey because if you watch the documentary, they even said, like I get some relief from that. And that's part of harm reduction, is recognizing that there are benefits to using substances. And that is the biggest shocker. Like, I've said that before and I've gotten so much hate. And the truth is that we all benefit from substances in our life. We benefit from coffee, from prescription pills. How many individuals go home to a glass of wine after a long day of work?
Absolutely. The socially acceptable use of substances, right? I mean, that's what we're talking about. People have agreed this is okay, right? You drink wine, it's considered classy, whatever. You smoke cigarettes, it's like, oh, it helps me cope with anxiety or stress, right? Or all of these things. But then when it comes to other substances, people are often demonized, right, as people who are, who have something wrong, when the reality is that people use substances. I mean, even in therapy now, we see that they're introducing a lot of psychedelics, right, into the idea and the concept of helping people really cope and work through trauma, right? So, I mean, it's not something that is simple to put in a box, right? This is good, this is bad. And this is something that's been explored forever. I mean, since the 60s and 70s, right, when people were using substances. I think that a lot of what you shared around the implications of how it's transcribed and definitely brought on a lot of the racial discrimination, a lot of the socioeconomic pieces into this speaks volumes, right? Because even back then, I mean, we're seeing white people who were considered hippies and they were doing drugs, and it was more like, okay, they're hippies, whatever. But people of color were demonized. I mean, they were seen as like trash, and I mean, that was the basically what they were trying to.
Yeah, I mean, the prime example that cannot be said any other way is the differential laws between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. And so if you don't know about that, it's that for the same amount of a substance, you can go to prison longer for obtaining crack cocaine than powder cocaine. And why is that? Because crack cocaine was predominantly used in low economic, usually black and brown communities, whereas powder cocaine was mostly used by the wealthy and the white and the upper class. And so, yes, and I think, when you talked earlier about the demonization of substances, we condone extreme alcohol usage because it's done by a certain class, a certain race. And when we talk about, the harder substances like methamphetamine or heroin or cocaine, those have been associated with black and brown and indigenous bodies.
And you're right. I mean, we can look at commercials, right, with alcohol, and it's people who look a certain way or doing a certain thing. It's considered classy, right? Like I could be sitting here with like a glass of, some fancy tequila and still look amazing, right? But then when we see visuals of other types of substance use, people automatically have this very like fear-based response to it. And I definitely think it has a lot to do with miseducation, a lot of ignorance.
Definitely, I don't think that we talk about it enough, so then it becomes this like taboo subject, right? And then it's like you were saying earlier, it's not either or. And the way I see substances is it can be medicine, and medicine can also be misused as well, right? And then also, I thank you so much for speaking about that that oppression, and how these systems of oppression are so ingrained into our society and how it affects our black and brown communities. And then I think it's important for us to talk about it and to acknowledge it, right? And then for me also is how do we heal from this as well too?
The healing process, I think, is part of why I love harm reduction, because it is saying, you are not a bad person for doing substances. And that has been the narrative for so long. You pick up a substance, you're automatically less than as a human. Harm reduction is saying, even though you use substances, you deserve the same healthcare, you deserve the same treatment, you deserve the same empathy, compassion as either someone that does use substances or someone that doesn't use them at all. It's saying you're still a human being, and that is first and foremost what matters.
Yeah. I love that. I love that because it definitely is a approach that considers the humanity, right? That we take individuals who are going through this process as human beings first, and everything else, is a circumstance. And I say that because I think it's so important to also acknowledge that when we're talking about substance use and how it's impact communities of color, we're dealing constantly with the pressure and the stress of navigating systems that are not on our side, that are not helpful. I mean, you're talking about the judicial system where people have been incarcerated. There's still people in jail right now who were caught because they used a certain amount of substance, right? Like you were sharing, they're still there because they get 20 years, 40 years for the same, things that other communities do, and they don't even get the same punishment.
Yeah.
And one of the things that really just makes me really upset is when I think about the Black and brown people that were placed in prison because of selling or using marijuana. And now it's legalized in California. And then you have like all these privileged white people that are making money off of it. And it's just like, okay, where's the reparation?
And the lounges and all of that stuff that is now, it's considered cool. I mean, I've gone to buy some and I'm going and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is like a boutique, or it feels like an Apple store.
You know what's funny is that we will never call those boutiques drug dealers. Because who do we think of when we think of drug dealers? We think of the Black and brown person that's low economic, selling it to teenagers and to young adults on the streets. Yeah. But it's again, these terms and the way that we have associated a certain person to these terms.
And it's so funny you're saying that because I was watching Pineapple Express with my partner, and that's a movie my brother absolutely loves because they love comedy and just the whole story behind it. But what I found fascinating about it was the way that even drug dealers, and you're right, were viewed, or the way they were kind of presented, right? Like the white drug dealers who were very like cool and like funny and like laid back and like people loved them. And then you had like the people of color and they're like aggressive coming in with guns and they're like these like really bad people. Yeah. And it was even in that scenario, like people of color never get as much compassion or understanding, or even about the circumstances that a lot of these folks who have been arrested or who have gone through this, this ordeal, we're doing it to survive, right? Yeah. We're doing it to live. We're doing it to help their families. I'm not justifying or talking about legalities. I'm talking about the circumstances behind a lot of these things that are not taken into consideration because we're easily swayed by guilty, not guilty, or black and white thinking, where it's like you're a bad person or you're a good person, but never seen as an actual human being. And why is this happening, right? Why is it happening in communities of color? Why is it happening with low, economic areas where people are at higher risk to being introduced to these things, or even having substances that are not pure, but actually go in and like less quality, right, and affect people. Yeah.
And something that I really want to get into, we were talking about the judicial system and like imprisonment, and like I'm gonna just call it how it is. Like the war on drugs is essentially the modern day slavery. What it has done is it has imprisoned so many black men. Black families are being separated from illegal drug tests on mothers. Like the stories are horrible, and you can do your history on this, like dating back to 70s and 80s when the war on drugs was coined. It was a dog whistle for let's find a new way to control black and brown bodies. And the mass incarceration is no different than how we have viewed slavery back in the days. Individuals that are being released from prison don't even have a right to vote in certain states. They're losing their rights, losing their families over, as you were saying, these minor drug charges that white folks get away with daily.
Yeah, and we're really pushing our viewers to think about this because the reality is that you have to understand this stuff is not something that happened 100 years ago, 200 years ago. This is so recent. I mean, we're talking about the civil rights where, I mean, you know, Martin Luther King would still be alive, right? And we're talking about age. A lot of these people would still be alive, and yet we portray it in black and white. So it looks so old that we all forget and we think we're living in this amazing society and this kumbaya, but it's still happening and it's still affecting us. Do we all know what was happening before that? Because it was not, people were still segregated and people were not allowed to be in each other's spaces because of the color of their skin. And this was not that long ago. So I think it's so important to be aware of that and understand that even though a lot of us like to sit on the idea of equality and all this stuff, the repercussions of history, of policy, of white supremacy live on, and they are still very much present. And I think when it comes to substances and what you were talking about with harm reduction, but the current models, we have to take those things into account because they have directly led into the way that as a society we see substances and the people who use them.
Yeah.
And, you know, we do have one more question, and if you want to ask that last one. This is because, like we were saying, right, media is a big part of this and the messages that are given out. So go ahead, let's ask that last question.
There's recently been a lot of discussion around substance use via media and entertainment, and especially on TV. So how would you analyze euphoria through a harm reduction perspective?
That's a very good question. So what I will say before I answer that question is I've watched all of season 1, and because of my own personal relationship with substances, I just thought it was best to practice that self-love and self-care and not watch season 2 because I know that it's a lot more graphic, and I've read about what has happened, and I think I made the right choice in not watching it to protect myself. But I think it is interesting. I really appreciate that the lead character, Zendaya, who is amazing, like give her all the awards, please, is a Black woman, because we need to humanize that experience. You know, we need to bring the humanity to Black individuals who use substances. I am so tired of seeing, you know, the Black felon on TV, on like Cops, like all these TV shows where they're just perceived as like a menace to society, you know?
I have to say that I was a little bit peeved at the fact that they did have to make her half white, which for some reason for me, I always feel like that's kind of like,
did they?
Her dad is white.
Okay, I kind of forgot because, like I said, I watched season 1 when it first aired, and then I haven't really caught up with it.
Yeah, and you know, it's interesting because I don't want to go too much into it for those who haven't seen it, but she is biracial in the show. And I always have this weird like feeling myself personally when we can't center around someone who is just Black, who is just Latino, who is just, but we have to kind of throw in a little bit, you know, to make it more. And I don't know if it's people being more receptive to it or socially it's like, oh, you know, she had a good life until this happened and now she's stuck with her Black mom, you know, and this is what's happening. And I don't want to overanalyze it, but I just wanted to point that out because I think for me it was like a response when I saw it. I was like, we're getting a story about, you know, this Black woman, and I love Zendaya too. Then you gotta throw that in the mix, and I'm like, oh, like it bothers me. I mean, they're not even in the show, but like now presently, but it's still like a fact in there.
Right. And another aspect of the show that I would kind of analyze, and I'm not sure if this is a critique or not, but I wish that they would talk about harm reduction more. It's really not a conversation in the show. It's really about like full-on sobriety. I will say that I think Zendaya's relationship with substances in the show is a dependency issue, and so maybe the intervention that is needed for her might be sobriety. But there are techniques that you can use to moderate there before you get right into sobriety. To go from using fast and hard to being completely sober, that is not easy. And especially from what I understand, it's opioid use that she's using. Like tapering off of that is so dangerous to your body. So that's why, like, you know, there's, again, I'm probably gonna get some flack for this, but here I go. Like, I know in season 2, like there's intravenous use, and so a harm reduction approach is actually smoking rather than using intravenously, because when you smoke, you have less chance of overdosing, and you have less chances of spreading diseases like hepatitis or HIV. So like that is an approach that like could be explored in this show, but I'm scared of how that would be perceived by people. I think people would be like, oh, you're advocating for smoking opioids or heroin, when it's like, no, we're talking about how do you reduce the harm and save lives.
And that's a misconception too, right? The fact that people think people just get off substances, right? Especially substances that, you know, we get on the streets, right? Like there's this idea that, well, why don't they just stop? Why don't they get sober? And I think something the show does really well is what you were saying, that it was a dependency, right? It really does reflect the fact that it's not simple. It's not as simple as people just not taking something. Their bodies react. You know, our bodies adapt. It's really, really hard. And I think I really enjoyed that aspect of it, that there's a lot of focus around how challenging that is, right?
Yeah.
Because she's very transparent in the show, where she's gone through this over and over and over. And you know, it's hard. It's really hard to watch, right? I know for a lot of folks. And at the same time, there is a lot of empathy for the character, right?
Yeah.
We see that, we hear it out there, right? People who are watching the show, who are fans, do have a lot of empathy for this character, right? In media. And so I'm always wondering, like, how do we see people who are not on the TV, right? Who are sitting out there, you know, who are navigating life with these challenges, right? In San Francisco, especially, because that's where we are, right? The Bay Area. And we have a big homelessness issue, which is, you know, we can go into as well, but that's also going into substance use, and a lot of it's connected. So
yeah, and you know, I made a post on Instagram about something you kind of just mentioned. You know, even though I'm not watching it, I really hope that people can realize that if you can have humanity and empathy for a TV character, then I hope you can have that same humanity and empathy for the stranger on the street, for the person in your family, or for yourself if you're someone that is struggling with substances. I find it really weird that all these individuals, you know, have all this love and they're rooting for Rue, and I wonder, is that being replicated in your actual life? And that to me is the disconnect. It was like all over Twitter. It was so funny because Twitter was like, Demi Lovato was trending, and I was just like, what are they trending about? And people were like, it's really funny how all of y'all want to like humanize Rue, but when a celebrity struggles with substance use, you demonize them.
The morality stuff comes out, right? All of these like black and white like statements around people come out. So Jesse, we do want to thank you again for coming on the show and talking to us about this.
Thank you.
Is there anything you'd like to share as a final words, or anything for the people that are watching this episode?
Yeah, one website that I really love and they do amazing work is endoverdose.com. I highly recommend it. They have fentanyl testing strips. You can get Narcan trained and then get Narcan actually delivered to your home. If you are someone that is, you know, engaging in substances or not even engaging in them, but, you know, you may be in spaces where it's happening, I highly recommend carrying Narcan on hand. A really sad fact is that the lead killer right now for young adults is actually not coronavirus, it's actually overdoses. We are in an overdose epidemic right now from the ages of 19 to 25. It has killed more people than COVID. And so carry Narcan, you can get trained, it's like 15 minutes, and get fentanyl testing strips on endoverdose.com.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing those resources, and, you know, and those tips. I think that, you know, people watching out there, whether you are a mental health professional or whether you are someone who is living this experience or someone who is supporting or has a loved one, you know, there is definitely a lot of information out there. And I know that sometimes we can get an influx or just get too much, but definitely harm reduction is something to really take another look at, and some of the tips and websites that Jesse provided. So thank you again, Jesse.
And let's like keep talking about this.
Yeah,
like
definitely.
it doesn't end here, right? Let's continue to talk about this.
Yeah, I would love that. Yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us for this episode, and Jesse too for being here and sharing your wisdom and knowledge. And congratulations on your MSW. I'm so excited to see you
Yes.
bring all of this into full circle.
Thank you.
Yeah.